And this isn't a YouTube anyway, so.
Do you want to just start the episode that way? You know what? Yeah, we were talking behind the scenes. Welcome, everybody. This is episode 83 of the Rule Your Pool podcast. Jared, it's good to see you. Although we missed a great opportunity to actually do this in person, but we ran out of time.
I know, it's been so long, all of like 3 days since I last saw you. And I'm looking forward to this episode because, boy, I had some lingering effects for a few days after our nice visit in Jacksonville, Florida.
Well, why don't you tell the audience what we did this past week?
So everybody, we decided we were going to take it upon ourselves to learn how to apply plaster to a swimming pool. And let me tell you what, my hammies and calves were screaming the day after we did that.
Yeah, we definitely have a new appreciation after getting in there on a hot Florida day, learning how to trowel and all that. But I had fun. See, you just weren't in shape for it. I'm fine. I'm not sore at all.
Buddy, my body's just not used to that kind of bending over. And to everyone that does that for a living, bravo, because, man, I kept lunging down on my butt to try and sit down and get in the sitting stance. And every time they were like, nope, you're not getting enough pressure on the trowel. You can't do that. And I was like, oh.
You got to lean down on it.
I know.
And, yeah, let's go into it. Episode 83, Rule Your Pool. Welcome to Rule Your Pool, the podcast by Orenda that explains and simplifies pool chemistry so that anybody, regardless of experience, can understand it. I'm your host, Eric Knight, bringing clarity to these subjects so that you can bring clarity to your water. If you're ready to rule your pool, then let's go. So the way this actually started, Jared, was about 2 or 3 years ago. It was actually right before COVID. And we were talking to John Temple, the owner of Tempool, and he has a training academy there. And he teaches hands-on plaster application, waterproofing, prepping, troweling of just about any surface, pebble, quartz, plaster, teaching how to operate the trucks, teaching how to mix. I mean, it's really a hands-on. If you don't know how to plaster, you come and you learn from Tempool for a week. And I said, I think we should do that because we deal with plaster problems all the time. And he just kept saying, well, come on down. What are you waiting for? Just come on down. And then, you know, the tyranny of the urgent takes over and we couldn't get there. And then COVID happened and then we just kept running out of time. And eventually we ran out of excuses. And we said, oh, you know what? We're going to be teaching a class with you, John, at Watershape University in November of this year at the International Show. I think it's probably time. It's time that we come down there and put our money where our mouth is. We said we were going to do this. Now it's time to show up and learn how to plaster.
Well, and not just that, we do answer a lot of questions on plaster problems, even though we're not plasters. And if we had a better understanding of how they're applied, how they're exposed, kind of the general understanding of how it's mixed and so forth, it makes us more of a resource and have a better understanding of what we're looking at after the fact. And it's safe to say we learned a lot. I know I did, and I'm pretty excited to talk about it.
For sure, because I've watched plaster crews, I don't know, a couple dozen maybe. I've watched pools get plastered, but that's not the same as being in the pit and actually holding the trowel and feeling that material, feeling the cement as it hardens and, you know, just trying to actually manipulate it into the crevices and the corners. That was hard work, man. Like it was no joke.
It was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. You know, you think you're just spreading peanut butter on a sandwich or something and no problem. And it starts off like that, ladies and gentlemen. It actually starts off like soup. And then it turns into peanut butter. And then it turns into cement. I know, shocking, cement. It is cementous surface. But either way.
No, it definitely.
It gets hard pretty quick.
Yeah, and within 40 minutes, it is a completely different material.
And when you suck at plastering like Eric does, you better get moving.
Wow. Shots fired from the guy who took more water breaks than I did. Now, admittedly, it was hot in Jacksonville, but there are people that do this for a living and do 2, 3, 4 pools a day. That's a lot of work. And, you know, 2 pools a day, every day, respect. I mean, seriously, respect. That is some hard work. And we had it easy. We were only doing a test pool. We didn't actually have to climb down into it. We just walked into it because it's only kind of like a half shell. We didn't have to worry about the mix design. We didn't have to prep anything. We just got in there and learned how to do it And we had some of the best plasterers in America right next to us, holding the trowel, showing us how to do it. We had some excellent coaching. Our thanks and gratitude go to Tempool for hosting us. And that was not a cheap undertaking either. I mean, we're talking a lot of material, a lot of man hours that they donated for us to learn this. And I feel like it's important for us to appreciate and truly understand and walk a mile in the plaster applicator's shoes to understand what is going on when these plasters get applied. We see marks like trowel marks or trowel burn, water troweling. We hear these terms, late hard troweling, ribs along the lower corners of the pool where you start seeing lines every foot, We've learned why those happen, and it's totally understandable. If you don't actually have coaching like we got at Tempool to learn what you're supposed to do instead of the habit, because I started doing something by instinct, even though I didn't have instincts developed, I'm thinking, well, naturally I would push the cement up the wall this way. And he's like, no, it's too late for that. Now you have to do it the other way. Why? Well, because if you don't do that, then the moisture is going to push up and you're going to start getting these ribs, these trowel lines, because on the outside of the trowel, you'll have less compaction. And I mean, there's a real art to this. And there's a science to it, frankly. Plaster applicators are artisans, in my opinion. Would you agree now that we've done it?
I would say it's a lot like a cake decorator or somebody that's applying icing and you're trying to sculpt it just perfectly with the right amount of pressure and getting it in the right place in the right time before it hardens. That's exactly what it's like. And you mess it up, you mess it up.
One of the things that I noticed the most between the Tempool guys who were coaching us and you, me, Sean, and Miguel, who had never held a trowel in our lives, except Sean. I think Sean did it before years ago.
He was sandbagging.
He was, yeah. He was trying to make us feel good about it. So, but the point is, there was a huge difference in their skill and ours. And I thought we did pretty well. They said we did pretty well. Maybe they were just blowing smoke at us. But what was one of the things that you noticed that was a big difference between the Tempool pros and us?
Can we say the size of our forearms?
I have huge forearms, man. I don't know what you're talking about.
You could tell the plaster guys when they're putting pressure on them. They can use the forearms and they know how to handle a trowel. I can say that for sure.
Well, they also were so smooth with it. They were transitioning from trowel to trowel. They knew exactly which trowel to have. They were doing complete sweeping lines. I'm using the wrong terminology, but you could tell they were on another level. You could tell that they do this a lot. And it was kind of a beautiful thing to see them transform this ugly wall into this beautifully pebbled surface.
We'll get into that and how hard it is. But, I mean, just so everybody knows, we had a 2-day process here. And we started basically from the beginning of the waterproof. Obviously, we weren't there when they shot the gunite shell, but that would take a little too long. But we applied.
Well, the shotcrete shell was put in 20 years ago.
Yeah, they're working with the same shell. It's almost as if it's not almost as if they just replastered this pool. So if you get your pool replastered, same process. So we started from the waterproofing phase, all right, and worked out from there. So we went into prepping the equipment, applying the plaster, and then the next day we went into the exposure side. So we can go from there, Eric.
Yeah, it was a 3-day process. Like you said, the first day, we were prepping the pool. We watched 3 different ways to put a waterproofing coat on. They rolled it on, they sprayed on a liquid version of it, and it didn't have a lot of texture, but it had better coverage. And then they used a mechanical pump, and they pumped a much thicker version of the same material that had a lot more texture to it. As Bill Drakeley said, you want that 3-dimensional bond plane so that plaster has a lot to get stuck to. So we watched that, and then they started prepping the truck for creating the plaster in the auger and shooting it down the hose.
There were some good things that I picked up from the waterproofing side of it, because on some of the pictures that we saw, there wasn't coverage, and these little divots and little crevices and just the uneven areas of the gunite after they chip out. And he was like, yeah, when you don't get all the way down and get full coverage, this is where moisture seeps in and you start getting problems in your plaster. Even though it looks fine here,
Yep.
that will be a problem later. So there are things that obviously we don't see when we inspect pools or look at, problems that are explainable when you start digging a little further into what happened and why. And waterproofing, in our opinion, we're big fans of it. It's an insurance policy in our opinion. And why would you not want that? But then we got into the different ways to apply it and how we get into delamination and potential calcium nodules coming through and all these other scenarios that we find every day. And according to Bill Drakely, a lot of these problems can be tied back to a waterproofing problem.
Right. Well, he also says he doesn't like waterproofing because you need that really good mechanical, as he says, three-dimensional bond plane between the plaster and the shotcrete. And when we watch this waterproofing get rolled on, those crevices and divots that did not get complete coverage, John was saying that's where you're going to get dots. That's where you're going to get hydration marks, and that's where you could potentially get calcium nodules because it's not waterproofed there. And we're talking about an area smaller than a dime.
Yes.
Okay. But there are a bunch of them because that's just kind of how the crevices are. And rolling on that material is not sufficient to fill in every nook and cranny. Whereas the spray-on would not have that issue. But you have to have texture so that you get that three-dimensional grip so that the plaster has a lot to stick to, because then you could get delamination. So there's a fine line between waterproofing, which we believe is important, especially in coastal areas, and having enough texture to make sure that the plaster can grab onto it. You can't just pick one or the other. You have to have that medium, and that's why he showed us three methods. The roll-on version, which had great texture but not great coverage. The liquid, which had great coverage but no texture. And the in-between with the mechanical pump, which is how Tempool does it, so that they can get the best of both worlds.
Just for y'all to get a visual, it's the same as when you get the texture spray on your walls. Same thing.
Right. Okay, so that was prep. What they do when they do a renovation, Tempool will go out the day before the plaster or a few days before, and they will actually prep it. They will waterproof it, they'll clean it, they'll do all this stuff to get ready for it, and then the crew comes in, and that's when they plaster. The exposure crew comes the third day. This is not all done in one day. I mean, we learned a lot. I'm telling you, a lot of the issues that you and I face on our hotline and in pictures that people email us, they make a lot of sense. And I want to go back to what Bill Drakely told us on this podcast. Shotcrete problems will be reflected in the plaster. You will see them through the plaster over time. And I think he's absolutely right about that, because we do see things like spots. Well, if you had a lack of coverage with your waterproofing, or you had a bit of a delamination there because you did not apply it properly and you didn't have enough of a grip in that spot, you could get moisture trapped back there. It's entirely possible. And I definitely have a new appreciation for the plastering process because it is detailed. It's not only physically hard, but it is a process you cannot cut corners on.
And it is a science. There's a reason for these mixes and formulas and the way that they are worked and applied and the end result. I mean, these things are all tied together.
Right. The water to cement ratio is paramount, not just in shotcrete, but in plaster as well. So that takes us to the truck. The mixing guy, at least in this company, is number 2 on the totem pole.
Yeah, they said he was the second most important guy there to make sure that everything flowed smoothly.
Literally. Oh, nice. Jared.
Pun intended. Pun intended.
Oh, Jared, you did it.
Yes.
You made a funny. It took 83 episodes, but you're on the team now. That's great.
You're welcome.
Let's just pause and reflect, everybody.
I just do what I can when I can, everybody.
That's our philosophy at our company.
And I just want everybody to know that Eric insisted that I read the show notes today.
I know. He's doing so well. I actually do have notes. Normally, it's just a few bullet points, but we probably didn't need them. You can go ahead and turn them off now.
Okay, good.
Anyway, so yes, the superintendent is the most important person because they are the one that is quality control, managing the crews, making sure they're moving properly. But the mixing guy doesn't have the superintendent watching him. He's on the truck, making sure it's blended right every time, that the chemicals are measured, the water is measured. And if you're off on that and the second batch is different from the first, you're going to have problems for sure. So I don't know where I was going with that, but sounded like a good idea to get into it at the time. Now, one of the things that I noticed a big difference between us and the pros was how little they move their feet. We're wearing these cleats so that we can stand in the plaster, and you only have 4 cleat holes on the ground.
Yeah, they're spikes, everybody. These aren't cleats. These are like 2-inch spikes that we're just trouncing around on this surface.
Right. They bolt through your shoes. And
Eric donated his shoes because his foot was too big. So
Yeah, well, I brought those shoes because they were trash shoes, but size 15, they don't make boots that big apparently. So those are now donated to Tempool. But when we were in the finishing stages, early on, it doesn't matter how much you move your feet. But when we started finishing the floor, we're making cleat holes. And so I'm watching these guys, and they're not moving their feet at all. You, Miguel, and I, and Sean, we're moving around way too much. And they brought it up, said, hey, the more you move, the more work we have to do. And this is setting up quickly. So I started watching their feet when I stepped out of the pit. I'm thinking these guys hardly move their feet, and yet they're covering almost a 360-degree radius around them. It's amazing.
Well, that's where they got into the bend over at your hips, because that's what you do. You sway and you work it around, but you have to have your legs spread. And I was just, everybody's just legs kind of shoulder length apart, straight down. You're just bending over and killing your back. These guys don't do that. They know how to do this.
Yeah, you got smoked because you're putting weight on that trowel. It's not force from your shoulder and your arm. You're leaning down on it, and then you're swiveling basically left and right. It was a pretty amazing process to watch these guys work. But honestly, I had a lot of fun. It was a cool thing to do. Like, I looked at that section of wall that was mine. I thought, I can't believe I did that.
I would not call myself a perfectionist by any stretch of the imagination. But when you're in there, whether it's painting a wall or drawing something or decorating a cake, doesn't matter. You just want to get it just right. And I felt myself just redoing things over and over just to get the lines smooth, get everything smooth. And they're like, you're working it too much. Stop, leave it alone, and move on. We'll come back and we'll fix this down the road. And I was like, what do you mean? We're here. It's setting up. We got to do this. And they're like, no, it needs to harden. This is a different stage. And I was like, okay.
Yeah, with a different trowel, different setup. I mean, the skill level these guys had, it's hard to describe on a podcast, but if you're listening to this and you've had a pool plastered, watch them. It is worth your time. It is a pretty remarkable skill that these guys have.
But I'd say the other thing that, like I just referenced, the steps of coming back. Well, one of those steps of coming back is to kind of clean the cream off the top after it's set up for a little bit. Because once you get it troweled, obviously the plaster is hardening and you want it to. And then right before it gets super hard in the in-between time, you kind of got to time this perfectly. You push the pebbles, we were doing a pebble surface, and you push the pebbles down so that you can compact everything. Well, when you do that, the cream of the plaster rises to the top, and it builds up a lot. And I was just absolutely shocked how much there was.
It's like a French press for coffee. Like, you're pushing down on this stuff and the cream rises to the top, and then you have to use your trowel to scrape that off.
It's like scraping butter.
Yeah.
You're scraping butter. And we had this tray we were, walking around with it. We were using the trowel and scraping it off into this butter holder. I don't know. And we had multiple of those butter holders, and they were just full of this cream. That's what it looked like. It looked like butter.
Yeah, blue butter.
And you have to get that stuff off. You have to get it off, or else it's going to cause problems down the road.
And then one of the coolest things was at the end, they pull out wet brushes. And these are just brooms, basically. And we start brooming the walls. Now, mind you, at this stage, we're out of the cleats. We've taken the cleats off, and now we're on sponges, basically. Soft cushioned feet. And we're on there brooming this material. And then they pull the hose out. And, when you're brooming, it just looks like a wet version of what you were doing. You could see the texture of the pebbles, but we'd already scraped the cream off. And just a light rinse finally exposed these dark black pebbles in this beautiful blue cement. It was amazing. We got some great footage of it. You could check it out on our Facebook Live. You could check it out. Multiple videos on Facebook. We'll have some B-roll as well. On the YouTube version of this, we may actually show some of that B-roll as we're talking. But it's just a remarkable thing to see your work within 2 hours of starting, from just blue goop to a beautiful pebble finish. It was a really cool, almost mesmerizing to watch.
I second what you said before, that the guys at Temple made us look really good, and I'm pretty sure they were just trying to make us feel better by saying we did a good job, because, man, they were in there for at least another 20 minutes after we all left, just filling holes in, just smoothing it out, and y'all did great.
Listen, we had to film. Somebody had to get out of the pit and film. Right.
Some people have to take phone calls, return emails. I mean, I get it.
We had water to drink.
Yes.
We had criticisms to throw at each other.
But they were awesome.
Yeah, they're really, really, really good. So then we wrap up. We finish the brooming, water it down. It's looking beautiful. And John Temple gives us a whole once-over of what to expect the next day. He said, what's going to happen now is this surface is going to start being carbonated. There's CO2 in the air, which we know is the initial part of carbonation. And most pools are going to start filling up immediately. This type of surface had a different approach because the exposure is done the next day. Now, some people will just fill up the pool and do a hot start, which is an exposure method, not a startup, by the way. Tempool doesn't do that. We don't recommend that either. We want to give it time so that the carbonation has time to rise to the top, which is going to look like a white dust almost. And sure enough, we come back the next day and it's got chalk marks all over the place. Where there was excess water on top of the bench, it was dripping down. You could see the lines. We have footage of this as well, just to show what the exposure is actually supposed to do. So the second day, that was the exposure. And what we did was divide up the pool into 3 sections where they were going to do a traditional acid wash with just an acid wash and a rinse. And then the second half of that acid wash was going to be an acid wash with a brushing, a rinse, then a bicarb wash to neutralize it, and a pressure wash to rinse it again. That's kind of like the advanced acid wash. And then the other half is with a proprietary product that Tempool uses called Pool Wash, which is not an acid wash, but does a really nice job at exposing. So the whole concept of the exposure is not just to burn away a whole bunch of cement. It's only to get rid of that carbonation that rises to the top and even out the surface.
It is acidic in some form, but it's not as acidic as the normal methods. So
we washed our hands with it. We washed our legs and hands with it.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too. You get this stuff all over your legs and hands, everybody. You don't just rub it off.
Oh, you're talking about the plaster?
Yeah, you don't rub it off.
Oh, yeah, it was stuck in my leg hair and everything. It was all in the learning experience. I don't regret a second of it. What are some of your final takeaways on the plastering process, Jared?
I think the exposure part of it, just the fact that he emphasized the bicarb rinse multiple times and that you have to neutralize the acid when you put it on there because, nobody's perfect. But I think we can all agree that neutralizing that acid after you get the exposure is pretty important here so that you can keep the acid that was on there from continuing to penetrate that surface and get it to a final stage of passing the baton on to the startup technician. And I think that's something that was reiterated over and over is, hey, whenever we leave this job, we are passing the keys on to the startup guy. And the better we can make it here, the better it's going to turn out over here. Everybody plays a part in this process. So that way you can't just point your finger at one specific person. And we all need to understand that we're working together to achieve a final result that is awesome, quite honestly. And once you get it to where you want it and you can say this is what's going to look like and this is the way it's going to happen and it actually happens, that's awesome.
That theme of passing the baton was repeated throughout our visit there. The Shotcrete guy does a good job. He passes the baton to the prep crew. The prep crew then preps the pool and passes the baton to the plaster crew. The plaster crew mixes everything correctly, applies the plaster correctly, and they pass the baton to the exposure guys. The exposure guys come and they expose the pool, and then they turn the keys over to the startup technician who turns the water on in a perfect world. In reality, there's not a lot of communication between these layers in most companies, and that's where we think most of the problems originate from. For instance, if the builder doesn't tell the startup technician when the water is going to turn on, they're not going to know. And they can't just do something at a spur of the moment that day. They need to know that the plaster is going to be applied tomorrow, or ideally several days' notice so that they can plan around it, because you want the startup technician there so that they can turn the water on with LSI balanced water. That's what is the ideal. But yet it doesn't happen very often. Finally, to wrap this up, Bill Drakely himself came down there and we reviewed our curriculum for that class, C3611, the Essential Plaster Workshop through Watershape University at the International Show. So we spent some quality time with both he and John Temple on what we're actually going to be covering in that class. So as a reminder to those of you in the trade, this is especially for plaster applicators and builders. That class will be offered November 12th and 13th in Las Vegas, and there's only 60 seats available, so sign up now while you can. Jared, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up this 83rd episode of our podcast?
I don't know if there's anything to add on that, but I just want to congratulate you, Eric, and I think we may have eclipsed 50 listeners.
Oh my gosh, it feels so good. We'll have to come up with a thank you speech when we have time to think about it.
I know. Well, we might celebrate it at some point down the line, but thank you, honestly, seriously. Thank you all for listening. We do really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy it. We do. I think we have a good time when we get on here and talk. And if there's any topics that y'all think we need to cover or you want more information about, please just shoot us an email or visit our website. Eric knows our URL. Go ahead, Eric. Give our URL.
You're still on the URL thing instead of the website? Great. I said URL one time.
Oh, you got confused. I'm sorry. It's our website. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's ask.orendatech.com. That's our help center. And if you're going to email us ideas for the podcast, that email address is podcast@orendatech.com. Thank you all so much for listening. We don't know what we're going to talk about in the next one, but Jared's going to be on it because we're about to record it.
Sweet.
So we're going to flip a coin and see what we talk about. Thanks so much, and we will see you in the next episode. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Rule Your Pool, a podcast by Orenda Technologies. For more information on what we discussed in this week's episode, check the links in the description or visit www.orendatech.com.
I hope you find this show valuable enough that you tap that subscribe button and share it with your friends. You can also like us on Facebook and social media. And with our help, you'll be able to rule your pool without over-treating it with chemicals and wasting money. I'll see you next episode.